At 71, some people are finally learning how to rest. But rest didn't come easily to him by that age. Johnny Cash had already lived through more noise than most people experience in a lifetime. Crowds, applause, long nights, loud rooms, familiar faces that change too often to keep count. From the outside, it looked like a life filled with purpose and direction. A man who always had somewhere to be, something to do, a reason to keep moving. But this story isn't about music. It isn't about fame. And it isn't about the life people think they know. It's about what happens when running stops working. For years, movement felt like survival. As long as he was busy, the thoughts stayed quiet. As long as there was noise, there was no need to listen too closely to what lived underneath it. Silence felt dangerous. Silence left too much room. So he filled it. He learned early on that staying in motion kept certain questions away. Questions about who he was without the stage, without the schedule, without the identity that came with being needed and recognized. When the lights were on and people were watching, everything made sense. When the night ended and the room emptied, things became less clear. So he avoided those moments, not intentionally, not consciously. He just kept going. One tour turned into another. One obligation replaced the last. The days blurred together, and the nights came late. Exhaustion became familiar enough to feel normal. When you live that way long enough, you stop noticing what it costs you. There was always a reason to keep moving. A commitment, a responsibility, an expectation. People depended on him, or at least, that's what he told himself. Being depended on felt like purpose, and purpose felt safer than stillness. Stillness asked questions he didn't want to answer at 71. The body begins to send signals you can't ignore anymore. The recovery takes longer. The quiet lasts longer. The mornings arrive earlier, and the nights stretch on without interruption. For the first time in a long while, there's space. Space can be uncomfortable when you've spent a lifetime avoiding it. He noticed it in small ways at first. The house felt bigger than it used to. The rooms held sound differently. The silence lingered even after the day was done. He would sit, expecting something to happen, only to realize there was nothing scheduled to interrupt the moment. That's when the past starts speaking, not loudly, not all at once, but steadily. Memories surface without warning. Not the moments people talk about, not the highlights. The moments that return are quieter, the ones that never fully closed, conversations that ended too soon, people who drifted away without a clear reason, feelings that were buried under activity and never revisited. He had always believed that moving forward was the same as moving on. That time naturally took care of things you didn't deal with. But time doesn't erase what you avoid. It preserves it, the truth is. Running works until it doesn't. There comes a point when there's nowhere left to run to. Not because the world ends, but because your energy changes. The drive that once pushed you forward begins to fade. And when it does, you're left face to face with everything you carried quietly for years. At 71. That wasn't the fear that crept in. The fear was simpler, quieter. He was afraid of finally stopping and realizing he didn't know how to be still. Stillness requires honesty, and honesty is difficult. When you've spent a lifetime avoiding certain truths, there were patterns. He began to notice in retrospect how often he chose distraction over reflection, how often he filled silence instead of sitting with it, how often he convinced himself that as long as he kept going, everything would eventually sort itself out. But life doesn't sort itself out on its own. It waits. He remembered people who wanted him to slow down long before he was ready to. People who asked questions, he brushed aside. Not out of cruelty, but out of habit. He had learned to deflect, to joke, to change the subject. To keep things light when they felt heavy. Heavy things slow you down, and slowing down felt dangerous. There's a certain kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, but from being constantly surrounded by people without ever feeling settled. A loneliness that hides behind noise and disappears when you're busy, only to return the moment you stop. At 71, that loneliness didn't announce itself dramatically. It showed up in quiet evenings, In moments where there was no one to perform for, no role to play, just the weight of being present with yourself. He had spent years telling stories through his work. Stories about pain, redemption, struggle, faith. But telling stories isn't the same as telling the truth to yourself. It's easier to express things through art than to confront them directly. Art gives you distance. Life does not. There were nights when he sat alone, aware that something inside him was unsettled. Not broken, not angry, just unresolved. Like a conversation that never reached its point. Like a song that ended before the last verse, and for the first time, you didn't know where to run. That realization didn't bring panic. It brought exhaustion. A tiredness deeper than the body. A tiredness of avoiding. Of moving without reflecting. Of filling silence instead of understanding it. At that age, you start realizing that the years ahead are fewer than the years behind. That realization changes the way you look at unfinished things. You no longer assume there will be time later. Later feels uncertain. And what remains is now, and now demands attention. He began to understand that the noise he once relied on had been a shield. A way to protect himself from questions he didn't know how to answer. But shields are heavy. Carrying them for too long takes its toll. At 71, he wasn't looking for forgiveness. He wasn't looking for redemption. He was looking for clarity. For a way to understand the life he lived without is hiding behind movement. This was the moment when running stopped being an option. Not because he chose to stop, but because there was nowhere left to go, and that's where the story truly turns. Because once you stop running, the silence doesn't just surround you, it speaks. When the noise finally fades, you expect relief. That's what most people think will happen. They imagine quiet as something gentle, something calming, a reward after years of effort. But quiet doesn't always arrive that way. Sometimes it shows up uninvited, carrying things you thought you had already outrun. At 71, silence didn't feel peaceful at first. It felt unfamiliar. The days were no longer packed tightly together. The nights no longer ended with exhaustion strong enough to push thoughts away. There were long stretches of time where nothing demanded his attention. No deadlines, no crowds, no schedules forcing him forward. And in that space, the mind began to wander. Not toward the future. Toward the past. It started with memories that felt harmless. Places, faces, moments that once felt distant. But as the silence continued, those memories grew sharper, more personal, less filtered. They no longer stayed on the surface. They went deeper. He began to remember people who had stood close to him at different points in his life. People who wanted more than his presence. People who wanted honesty, reassurance, explanation. At the time, he believed his actions spoke loudly enough, that showing up was the same as opening up. Now, he wasn't so sure. There's a difference between being present and being reachable. He had been present many times, but reachable, that was harder. He kept parts of himself guarded, not because he wanted distance, but because he didn't know how to lower it. For years, strength meant control. Control over emotions. Control over image. Control over the pace of life. Losing that control felt dangerous. Vulnerability felt like stepping into unknown territory without a map, so he avoided it. The silence made that avoidance impossible. When the nights grew quiet, there was nothing left to distract him. No sound to lean on. No movement to hide behind. Just thoughts arriving one by one, asking questions he had ignored for decades. Why did I always keep moving? What was I afraid would happen if I stopped? Who would I be without the noise? Those questions didn't come with clear answers. They came with discomfort, with a sense that something important had been postponed for too long. He noticed how often he had used busyness as an excuse. Not deliberately, not dishonestly, but consistently. There was always something else to do. Something else that felt more urgent than sitting with feelings. Didn't fully understand. Urgency is a powerful shield. As long as something feels urgent, reflection can wait. But at 71, urgency loses its grip. The body slows down whether you agree with it or not. The calendar empties whether you're ready or not. And when urgency disappears, honesty takes its place. That honesty didn't arrive as regret. Not yet. It arrived as awareness. Awareness of patterns he could no longer ignore. Patterns of avoidance. Of emotional distance. Of conversations that never reached the point where something real could be said, he began to see. How often he deflected seriousness with humor. How often he turned inward moments outward. How often he chose performance over presence. Performance had always been safer. On stage, there were rules, expectations, a structure. In real life, things were messier. Emotions didn't follow a script. They didn't resolve neatly. They lingered, so he stayed where things felt predictable. But predictability comes at a cost. Over time, it creates a quiet gap between you and the people who care about you. They stop asking certain questions because they assume the answers aren't coming. They stop pushing because pushing never worked before. And slowly, without conflict or drama, distance forms. Not because of anger, not because of failure, but because of silence. That realization settled in heavily. He wasn't haunted by mistakes. He was haunted by absences. By moments where something could have been said, but wasn't. By feelings that were felt deeply, but never expressed clearly. There's a particular sadness in realizing that people may have misinterpreted your silence as indifference. That they may have walked away not because you didn't care, but because they couldn't feel it. He didn't blame them for that. How could he? Silence leaves too much room for misunderstanding. At 71, reflection doesn't feel rushed. It feels thorough. You don't skim over memories anymore. You sit with them. You examine them from angles you never considered before. You ask yourself questions you avoided when life was louder. What did I protect myself from? And what did that protection cost me? He understood now that noise had been his armor. Movement had been his shield. It kept him from feeling overwhelmed. They kept him functional. They also kept him distant. Armor protects you in battle, but wearing it forever keeps people from touching you. That's a hard thing to accept late in life. Not because it means you failed, but because it means you lived in survival mode longer than necessary. As the days passed, the silence became less threatening, but more demanding. It didn't shout. It waited. It asked him to acknowledge what he had been carrying all along. He realized he wasn't afraid of silence itself. He was afraid of what silence revealed. Without noise, there was nowhere left to hide from himself, and that's when the weight of unfinished things began to press more heavily. Not as guilt, not as shame, but as a quiet understanding that some parts of life had been left unexplored. He didn't know yet what to do with that understanding. He only knew that ignoring it wasn't an option anymore. Running had stopped, noise had faded, and what remained was honesty. But honesty is only the beginning, because once you see what silence has been holding for you, a new question emerges. Not what went wrong, but what do I do with this now? That question doesn't demand an immediate answer. It waits. At a certain point in life, you stop fighting the answers that arrive quietly. You realize that some questions were never meant to be solved quickly. They were meant to sit with you, to change you slowly, to soften the way you look at your past instead of tearing it apart. At 71, finally understood that silence hadn't been empty all those years. It had been full. Full of things he wasn't ready to face yet. Feelings that didn't disappear just because he stayed busy. Thoughts that waited patiently while he kept moving, now that he had stopped. Those things didn't feel hostile anymore. They felt honest. He no longer asked himself why he had lived the way he did. That question had lost its sharp edges. Instead, he began asking something simpler, something kinder. What did I learn from it? He learned that noise had helped him survive. That movement had kept him standing when stillness would have overwhelmed him. That staying busy had been a way to cope, not a flaw. And for a long time, it worked. But he also learned that survival isn't the same as connection. Connection requires presence. And presence requires courage. That courage didn't come naturally to him. It never had. He wasn't built to expose himself emotionally. He was built to endure, to carry weight quietly, to keep going when others slowed down. and that wasn't something he regretted. What he regretted, if regret was even the right word, was assuming that endurance alone was enough. There were people who needed words, not strength. People who needed reassurance, not consistency. People who wanted to know what he felt, not just what he did. He understood now that silence had spoken for him in ways he never intended, that it had created distance even when closeness was wanted, that it had left questions unanswered that could have been resolved with a few honest sentences. But those sentences were never spoken. And now, at 71, he knew better than to punish himself for that. Punishment doesn't bring peace. Understanding does. He accepted that he had lived according to the tools he had at the time, tools shaped by his generation, by his experiences, by what he was taught mattered most. He wasn't wrong to use them. They simply weren't complete. That realization brought a quiet sense of calm. Not relief, not joy, but calm. Calm in knowing that his life didn't need to be rewritten to be understood. Calm in knowing that mistakes didn't define him, but they did teach him. Calm in knowing that even late understanding still had value. He stopped wishing for different endings. He stopped replaying moments looking for a better line, a better response, a better version of himself. He knew now that the man he was then couldn't have acted the way the man he is now would. Growth doesn't move backward. It only shows you where you've been. At this stage of life, acceptance feels more important than answers. You don't need everything explained. You just need to be at peace with what is. And he was beginning to feel that peace. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt settled. It's like a room after a long conversation has finally ended. Nothing left to say, nothing left to prove. He didn't feel the need to confess anything to the world. Some truths are meant to stay personal. It's meant to be acknowledged quietly. Meant to be carried with understanding instead of shame. What mattered most was that he no longer ran from himself. He sat with his thoughts without needing to escape them. He allowed memories to come and go without judging them. He accepted that. Parts of his life were unresolved, and that resolution didn't always mean fixing it. Sometimes meant letting be. At 71, he didn't claim wisdom. He claimed clarity. Clarity that strength and openness were never enemies. Clarity that silence had protected him, but it had also isolated him. Clarity that it was okay to understand something late, because late understanding is still understanding. And maybe that's the quiet truth that stayed with him. Not that he should have lived differently, but that he finally saw his life clearly. If this story felt familiar, it's because it isn't just about one man. It's about anyone who spent years staying strong, staying busy, and staying quiet. Anyone who kept moving because stopping felt dangerous. Anyone who reached a moment in life where silence finally asked to be heard. If parts of this story resonated with you, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. And if you appreciate calm, reflective stories like this, stories that don't rush, don't shout, and don't pretend, make sure to like this video. Subscribe to the channel. There are many stories like this still waiting to be told. Sometimes all it takes is finally stopping long enough to listen,